following stories on related information are compilations from around the world. This video should be taken with caution because these stories are clearly weird and most definitely bizarre. A local man, Wilbur Riddle, searching for discarded equipment to salvage and potentially sell along Route 25 near Georgetown, Kentucky, on the 17th of May 1968 discovered a decomposing body wrapped in a green tarp. Due to the unclear circumstances of the case, police were unable to identify the body, as defined by features and anatomy to be that of a woman, but anything much more than that didn't lead to any formal identification or clues as to how and why she was murdered. Despite the case of the woman gathering local attention of the community at the time, the remains were buried in the Georgetown Cemetery in 1971. A local company offered funds to erect a headstone upon the plot where the woman was buried. More than 20 years later, in 1998, police identified the mysterious tent girl as she was now known as Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor. A then young man, Todd Matthews of Tennessee, who helped to identify Barbara as his wife, was actually the daughter of Wilbur Riddle, whose death haunted Wilbur for the rest of his life. Todd became interested in the case and looked into details relating to it. In 1997, he created an internet website to promote discussion for the tent girl, also to find out the exact details of who she was. In 1998, through his searching, he discovered a description of a woman similar to Tent Girl on a missing persons website. The woman had disappeared just a short distance from where Tent Girl's body was discovered in 1968. After contacting the family and arranging for a DNA analysis, it was found out to be indeed Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor. Further analysis discovered that Barbara had children prior to her murder, and a daughter of hers even married and had a family of her own by the time her mother's disappearance was solved. The family decided to let Barbara rest in the cemetery where her body was buried once again. However, the actual person who murdered Barbara was never technically brought to justice. Barbara's family refused to allow her married name upon the tombstone. Records mentioned that her husband was a George Earl Taylor and was the main suspect in the murder, but he was never convicted nor arrested, as he later died of cancer in 1987. John Sloot was a proclaimed Dutch inventor who supposedly devised a then new sort of data encoding technology in 1995. He mentioned that he had devised the technology over a number of years previously, as the coding system he conceived of could have been theoretically even revolutionary for the time. The technology exactly had to do with the compression on how much could have been saved to storage, as the technology could have put entire industries out of business with the possible data storage and compression method. At first, there were initial claims of skepticisms, but due to the possibility of the coding technology, John Sloot began to receive investment-based funding for his coding system. But as time went on, he became increasingly paranoid about those around him, and if his technology would have been stolen and mass-produced without his consent. This was one of the main reasons why the exact details of his coding technology was so mysterious, as he wouldn't let anyone else examine or evaluate the equipment he possessed, out of fears that they would have learned how to copy the method that he devised. As the details surrounding his technology and methods gained more and more interest and controversy, on the 11th of July 1999, John Sloot was found dead at his residence. Initial claims were that of a heart attack, as his family consented to an autopsy, but none was ever performed. He had also died shortly before an arrangement was to have been reached regarding the production and development of his technology. His residence was also discovered to have been searched, and a good amount of records or information pertaining to his coding system were missing. On the 1st of December 1948, police were contacted after locals had discovered the body of a man in Somerton Park Beach near Adelaide, South Australia, and had nothing of real identification upon his person, and just had bare essentials in his trouser and coat pockets. Once word had spread about the mysterious body being discovered, witnesses had said that the body was seen in the same location for a decent amount of time previously by locals, but no one had thought of it to be too odd or peculiar. Everyone had just assumed that he was a drunkard or just a man resting along the beach's edge. The accounts went into more detail, mentioning that people had seen him in the exact same position, not moving at all, while others commented that the unknown individual wasn't responding to the flies and mosquitoes all around him, but the consensus was that he was deeply sleeping, so that they didn't question too much the individual sitting from their point of view. Autopsy details haded that the man was possibly of a British background. On age at the time of death was roughly 40 to 45. He was mildly muscular, on also 180 centimeters, with grey eyes and slight ginger-colored hair. His hands and nails weren't that of a manual labored background. Feet showed signs that he normally wore boots, and developed calf muscles which reinforced the notion of boot wearing. The clothes he had worn bore no tags of manufacturing, but the clothes in question seemed to be in good condition and well kept. On the 14th of January 1949, staff at the Adelaide railway station discovered a suitcase with labels removed and had been checked into the station on the 30th of November 1948. Details of the suitcase haded that it might have been manufactured or produced in part within the United States, but it was never confirmed. An inquiry into the Somerton man's death and details of who he might have been was largely inconclusive, as public opinions and rumors were rampant as to who he was and how he had died. At the time, it was speculated that details of the Somerton man might never truly be known. During the inquiry, a small piece of paper with the term "Tamam Shud" was discovered in a hidden pocket within the Somerton man's trousers. Linguists identified it as a term or phrase of Persian origin, meaning ending, ended, or finished. The phrase was linked to a personal compilation of quatrains, as the police sought to find more information relating to the book. As through a publicity campaign of the time, a copy of the book was discovered in New Zealand. Relating to the book, a number of letters written in a sort of code was later discovered. As to what the code was and what it could have possibly represented to the Somerton man was never fully explained or fully understood, as the Somerton man was later laid to rest with a pauper's funeral on the 14th of June 1949. As to who he is and why his body was discovered at that particular location will never be fully known. On the 31st of March 1922, in a small farm located 70 kilometers north of Munich in Germany, 6 people aged from the oldest being that of 72 years to the youngest being that of just 2 years were all found dead within a farmstead. At the time, the region was distant from other settlements, and the news of the murders were slow to reach other areas in Germany. Shortly before the murderers occurred, locals mentioned odd and strange occurrences in and around the farm. A few months before the murders were discovered, a maid had quit employment there. Unfounded rumors were that the maid had quit due to hearing unexplained sounds coming from the attic and got the impression that the farm had become haunted. One of the residents later found a newspaper on the property from Munich, but couldn't recollect anyone buying that particular paper and came to believe that a postman might have accidentally dropped it on the property while they were making their route, at which it was later discovered by the residents. Days before the murders were discovered, unknown footprints were discovered on the property. Due to the unclear circumstances of the murder as well as the political and social situation in Germany during the 1920s, there have been various theories as to why the murders were committed and who might have done it. On the 21st of October 1978, Australian pilot Frederick Valentik disappeared during a training flight over the Bass Strait between the Australian mainland and the island of Tasmania. The exact details of the disappearance had that he was a young pilot, and at the time of the disappearance, he had roughly 150 hours of flying experience. He was qualified to fly at night, but only in good conditions. He applied twice to join the Australian Air Force but was denied due to insufficient educational experience. Prior to his disappearance, he was known to have been in aeroplane incidents and applied to become a commercial pilot but was refused due to his lack of piloting experience and recklessness in the cockpit. His father later commented on being fearful for his son's safety when he flew, as his father said that Frederick was a firm believer in unidentified flying saucers and was often worried about being attacked by an unknown craft while flying. The exact details of his disappearance had him radio Melbourne Flight Control to report during the flight that an unidentified craft was following him at 1400 meters. Radio control mentioned to him that there were no known aircraft at that particular level in the air around him. He later mentioned to flight control that the craft was large and had 4 bright lights upon it. He couldn't confirm the type nor its shape, but it passed 300 meters above his plane and was moving at a great speed, and that it was approaching him from an eastern position. Flight control mentioned that the other pilot could have been intentionally messing with him, as Frederick later reported engine problems. And when asked again by flight control to describe the aircraft, he mentioned that it wasn't an aircraft, as the transmission was then interrupted by an unknown noise, described by those who had heard it as metallic scraping noises, before all contact was lost. Antoinette Cayetito disappeared from her home along Route 66 in Gallup, New Mexico in the early morning hours on the 6th of April 1986. When Antoinette's mother went to her bedroom to wake her for religious school one morning, the mother learned that she wasn't there. Though police were later called at the time, there were no informational details as to what happened to Antoinette. Supposed sightings of her were reported over the years. Almost a year after the initial disappearance from the Gallup Police Department, it received a distress call from a young girl who claimed to be Antoinette, as she had said that she was being held in Albuquerque, but before the child could reveal where exactly she was, an unidentified man was heard shouting at her, and sounds of a fight or scuffle were heard on the phone before the call abruptly ended. 4 years after the disappearance, a waitress in Carson City, Nevada, came across a teenage girl similar to Antoinette's description in the company of an unknown couple. The girl often tried to get the attention of the waitress but was unable to. Once the group had left, the waitress cleaned up the table that they were sitting at and found a napkin with the words written upon it, "Help me, call the police." 5 years after the disappearance, one of her sisters, aged 10 at the time, mentioned that the night of the disappearance, there was a knock at the front door at around 3 a.m. As the girls were still awake at the time, Aunt Antoinette answered the door. When Antoinette asked who was on the other side of the door, a man said Uncle Joe, and when Antoinette opened the door, she was abducted by 2 men. She was later seen kicking and screaming and was forced into a nearby parked van as it then quickly drove away. When asked as to why her sister didn't reveal the information before, the sister mentioned that she was afraid of her mother and not being believed by anyone for her claims. Antoinette's youngest sister later mentioned that the entire disappearance destroyed her family. Police authorities eventually theorized that Antoinette Cayetito was a victim of potential human trafficking, on no definitive conclusion to her case, where she had gone, or even if she was still alive, had ever been reached. Ursa and Sabina Eriksson were Swedish citizens that had come to the United Kingdom in May of 2008. The pair had been in Ireland prior to traveling to Britain and were waiting for a bus en route to London and Liverpool. During the waiting for the bus, at a station they displayed increasingly erratic and eccentric, even disturbing behavior, which caused the bus driver to refuse them entry back onto the bus. British traffic officers arrived to apprehend the women, but upon seeing them the pair fled across the motorway, and while one of the sisters dodged the traffic, the other was hit by a car. The both of them were later treated for injuries, some of which were serious. Then, the pair were released in Stoke-on-Trent. A local, Glenn Hollenshed, took pity on Sabina and offered her lodging at his residence, at which Sabina later stabbed him to death the next day. Sabina was later seen fleeing the murder scene and arrested. Despite the bizarre occurrences, there was no evidence of drugs within their blood. Speculation had it that the pair suffered from a shared psychosis, as Ursula was later released from hospital, but Sabina was imprisoned for a period of years before her release in 2011 and being sent back to Sweden. The Mad Gasser of Mattoon was a title given to the person or persons to be responsible for a series of gas or odor-related incidents in Mattoon, Illinois during the mid-1940s. More than 24 attacks of gassings were reported to authorities over a period of 2 weeks. The incidents were that the supposed victims smelled strange gases coming from their homes or particular areas, which were then quickly followed by temporary paralysis, heavy coughing, disorientation, and vomiting. Local authorities were reported as to being skeptical of the exact nature of the gassing incidents. Despite claims by those who were victims of the odor-related incidents, no actual evidence was ever recovered from any of the crime scenes. On the said examples of the gassings had simple and logical explanations, depending on where the person might have held the proposed incident, on what sort of odor or gas might have been smelt or even seen in the area affected. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was an American killer, rapist, thief, and former police officer that committed 13 confirmed murders, 51 rapes, and 120 burglaries across California from 1974 through 1986. His crimes were so well known that the media in the state called him by many aliases due to his crimes. Depending on the region of California, he was known as the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, and the Night Stalker, but due to another killer in California taking the alias, DeAngelo was later called the original Night Stalker. During the years DeAngelo was committing his crimes, he taunted and threatened victims, as well as police in phone calls, and left messages for detectives to find and goaded them into attempting to catch him. But due to limitations with crime scene evidence-based technology of the time, he was able to elude authorities for decades. In 2013, there were renewed efforts to find who the killer was and to bring them to justice for the crimes they had committed decades previously. In 2016, the FBI announced a nationwide effort with renewed attempts on more advanced technologies to re-examine old pieces of evidence from the crimes that were committed decades previously. In 2018, DeAngelo was connected to the crimes based on DNA evidence. However, due to laws in California, he couldn't be charged for the rapes that he had committed in the 1970s, but was connected to other crimes such as kidnapping and attempted abductions. In 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was convicted of various crimes and sentenced to life imprisonment. The monster with 21 faces was a term used to describe a group responsible for a series of blackmail letters against the Japanese company Glyco in 1984. At roughly 1700 hours, two masked men with what were assumed to be weapons entered the home of the then president of Glyco, Katsuhiko Izaki. The intruders tied up members of Izaki's family before finding him and later abducting him to a warehouse in Osaka. After being held captive for 3 days, Izaki was able to escape, but when asked by authorities as to who kidnapped him and why, he wasn't able to identify who did it nor the reasons for his kidnapping. On the 8th of April 1984, a letter was sent to local police with explicit details of the abduction. On this letter held details which were impossible for someone not related to the case to have known about, as the details mentioned in the letter were considered a legitimate source. Another letter was sent to media outlets as well as local police. Media later reported that the group had tainted millions of dollars worth of product. However, through searches, nothing was ever found, but regardless, Glyco products were removed from store shelves. Due to the whole incident at the time, the company reported an immediate loss of 20 million United States dollars, and 450 workers were sacked from their jobs. In total, Glyco lost sales and revenue in roughly of 130 million US dollars. On the 26th of June 1984, the monster with 21 faces issued a public message mentioning that it forgave Glyco and harassment of the particular company stopped. In late 1984, more letters were then sent to employees or people affiliated with other companies on fears of poisoning products, in a similar method to what occurred with Glyco happened once more. No results were ever made from these instances. Unable to capture or apprehend anyone related to the incidents, a police superintendent associated with the case set fire to himself and died in a suicide attempt in August of 1985. In response to the suicide, the Monster with 21 Faces group sent a final letter to media and then was never heard from again. Due to the laws regarding kidnapping in Japan, the state ended in June of 1995. Poisoning statutes ended in 2000. It was later theorized that over 1 million Japanese law enforcement officials had been affiliated with the case, but no person or persons were ever convicted or even identified of any related crime. Owen Paulfield was a man who boasted about the many things that he had done throughout his life, and was a well-known individual in the small community of Shepton Malay in Somerset, England. In the 1760s, when Owen was in his 60s, what he had done throughout his life had finally caught up with him, and he was nearly paralyzed and often had massive trouble moving even for the most simple of errands. The exact date or even year of the disappearance is uncertain, with some sources mentioning 1763 and others 1768. Due to the warm evening, Owen desired to sit outside his residence to enjoy the night. But due to him being nearly crippled, he needed assistance from his sister and a neighbor. With his sister in his residence, and a short distance away locals were working, anyone could have easily heard Owen if he needed help or assistance. So Owen was in sight of multiple people the entire time. As the weather that night started to turn, Owen's sister came out to help bring him back inside once more. But when she went to where he had been placed, Owen was missing. Thinking it odd, she asked the nearby locals what might have happened, and they commented that they didn't see or hear anything related to him. Fearful of what might have happened, Owen's sisters got people from the community to search the area, but people assuming that he'd be quickly found, he never was. At the time, rumors were abound that some thought he had been taken by the devil, and others even believed that pirates had abducted him to reveal locations of buried treasure from his youth. Eventually, the story of Owen Paulfield disappeared until 1813, when local construction in Shepton Malay unearthed the skeleton. As once word spread, many believed it to be Owen's. However, medical analysis revealed that it was a woman's skeleton and not an elderly man, as Owen was at the time. There was another example of construction in the area in 1933, but nothing brought about a definitive answer as to what happened with Owen Paulfield. As the years, decades, and even centuries passed, countless theories emerged to explain his disappearance. The lost Dutchman's gold mine, among known by other definitions, is, according to local superstition, a massive gold mine hidden somewhere in the southwestern United States of America. Though the actual location is debated, consensus is that the area is within the Superstition Mountains near Phoenix in Arizona, though the exact details about the mine are unclear, and speculations of its details don't make much sense. Within the United States, it's often considered to be the most famous lost mine, as it was supposedly named after a German immigrant to have discovered it in the 1800s and kept its exact location a secret to keep all of the gold for himself. People have been estimated to have been searching for it since at least 1892. Rumors of a mine was reported to have gone back in the region to roughly the 1870s, as other presumed locations were in Colorado, California, and other regions in Arizona. Details of the mine vary, but there were particular facts that always appeared in discussions of the purported legends in relation to the mine. Members of the Apache tribe, indigenous peoples of the region, were said to have discovered and mined it somewhere in the Superstition Mountains. A Mexican man later rediscovered the mine and began to extract gold from it, only for him to be attacked or killed by Apaches who discovered him at the mine in roughly 1850. A later account had it that a Dr. Thorne medically treated a wounded Apache chieftain, and for saving his life, the doctor is allowed passage into the mine. Supposedly, the doctor is blindfolded and escorted the entire way along an extraordinary path, and once he's at the mine, his blindfold is removed and he's allowed to see, later take and carry as much as he can hold, before being blindfolded and escorted back to the place from which he has started from. Accounts have the doctor being unable or unwilling to return to the said location of the mine. A different version had it that one or two German men were searching through the area for the mine and eventually found it, but were attacked and wounded by Apaches and later fled. While being treated by our doctor for the wounds, the man or men mentioned the location to the doctor. Then the man or men died from their wounds inflicted by the Apaches during the attack. From 1976 through 1977, 2 boys and 2 girls aged 10 through 12 went missing to or from their homes or related locations in Oakland, just north of Detroit, Michigan. When the children's bodies were discovered, it was always within roughly 19 days of the reported disappearance. The causes of death were either strangulation or being shot. as the boys were abused prior to their bodies being discovered. The murderer was called the Oakland County child killer as a result. Despite the fact that there were 4 confirmed killings, there were also suspected of cases relating to other children, but these claims were never confirmed. A few weeks after the murder of the last official victim at the time, a psychiatrist working with police received a letter, as it was full of spelling and grammar-based errors. In the letter described 2 people. Details mention that they, being Alan, was the slave of the killer, being that of Frank, as the both of them were in the Vietnam War, and that Frank was traumatized for having to kill children in Vietnam. Alan expressed fear, and due to the situation with Frank, his life was in danger, as he was suicidal as a result, and even admitted in accompanying Frank during abductions. Arrangements were that the psychiatrists were to meet Alan at a safe location, but Alan didn't show up and was never heard from again. The Tolan Bay Tiles, or alternatively known as the Tolan Bay plaques, are purported messages of unknown origin embedded within pavement or streets across major cities in the United States, as well as other cities in South America. The exact number of the tiles were reported to have been in the hundreds, since the originals were discovered in the 1980s. The dimensions of them were roughly 30 centimeters by 15 centimeters, but such tiles have been found in larger sizes. Nearly all of them contain references, variations, or meanings from the main description of the tiles. More intricate tiles make political statements or encourage people who read them to create similar tiles in a copycat method. The tiles refer to American film director Stanley Kubrick and Arnold Joseph Toynbee, an English philosopher, as well as the planet Jupiter. Details how the tiles first photographed in the late 1980s on first media reference from 1994. In the United States, tiles were seen as far west as Kansas City, far north as Boston, and far south as Richmond. However, since 2002, few new tiles were considered to be that of the original artist outside of Philadelphia, but due to their placement, many of the original tiles have been worn down by foot traffic, automobiles, and the environment. On the 29th of November 1970, an unknown woman's body was discovered by hikers in Oakland, near the city of Bergen, Norway. The Estal Woman was a title given to the unknown woman due to the location where her body was discovered in. When authorities came upon the scene, she was in a position where the body was upon its back and her arms clenched near her torso. The front of her body itself as well as her clothes were burned, despite a campfire or any sort of flammable substance not being anywhere near the body. Due to the burns, the woman was unrecognizable, and there were minor belongings around the corpse, but there were nothing in terms of details which pertained to the woman's identity. But around the body were slight traces of burnt paper, on a fur hat which had traces of petroleum. 3 days later, at the Bergen railway station, 2 suitcases were discovered and later linked to the unknown woman. As within one, police discovered 100 Deutschmark banknotes, which were equivalent to 137 United States dollars in 1970. Also within were various items on coinage of a number of European countries. But as with the body, any real aspects of identification on the items were removed. An autopsy upon the body revealed that the woman had died from a combination of being drugged and poisoning by carbon monoxide. Soot was found within her lungs, as it was theorized she was still alive and breathing while her body was being burned, and there were bruises upon her neck, which give hints to a possible fall or impact by blunt weapon. Blood work revealed that there were an excess amount of sleeping pills in her stomach and throughout her bloodstream. Through details to the media, information that she had traveled around Norway with a number of fake passports and aliases, as witnesses commented that she had remained to herself. According to information on the passports, she most often referred to her nationality as Belgian, and forms written in the passports were either in German or French. Through travels, the woman had mentioned to locals that she was a traveling saleswoman and antiques dealer. Despite sketches of the woman's likeness were made public, The woman was never formally identified on the case, eventually closed. The Shimayama Incident pertained to the disappearance and death of Sanadori Shimayama, the then first president of Japanese National Railways in Tokyo, Japan on the 5th of July 1949. Shimayama was president at a tumultuous time in the railway's history, as shortly after the end of the Second World War, the Japanese nation was in the midst of a recession. Due to the policies of the Japanese government to cut back spending, he was tasked with saving as much money as possible. He was personally responsible for a list of sacking 30,000 employees at the time, as which the order was given by the United States government and enforced by the United States military within Japan at the time to put in check the Japanese Communist Party's influence within the country. It was speculated that Shimayama was made to take the blame for the cutbacks on employee losses by both the Japanese and United States governments. As days before his actual disappearance and eventual death, he reportedly received death threats from high-ranking United States military officers to make sure that he had went through with the budget cuts and employee sackings. On the morning of, he was under a massive amount of pressure as he was seen by multiple people doing various errands, but he was last seen before an important meeting 9 o'clock in the morning. When word spread that he didn't show for the meeting, this caused a great amount of concern at the railway headquarters as police were later contacted. On the 6th of July, slightly midday, his dismembered body was found along the Joban line in Adachi. He had been hit by a train. Looking into the details surrounding his final hours, he was seen by station attendants at Adachi matching the physical description of Sanadori Shimayama, walking south along the Tobu Isesaki line the night before. Analysis of the body concluded that he had died before being hit by the train and dismembered as a result of the train's impact. The exact cause of death wasn't able to be determined, but further examination of the body parts gave a possibility of internal bleeding, which could have been inflicted through repeated punching or kicking, such as being beaten to death. Others have examined the remains to conclude that Shimayama committed suicide by allowing himself to be struck by the train, but the actual crime scene itself wasn't able to be fully examined due to rainfall in the area, at which, due to the bad weather, destroyed possible evidence by it washing away.